Skip Gilmour. I'm here to be the moderator for the panel on exploitation and digital platforms by terrorists and violent extremists, For those who don't know me, which is most of you, I believe, I am the director of tech policy and solution at the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, or GIFCT. For those who are maybe not familiar with GIFCT and what we do, we are a global nonprofit organization that works with our over 30 member companies in order to coordinate information sharing in the moments where we have a terrorist or violent extremist attack that occurs with an online nexus. So what we really do is we use our instant response framework and our hash sharing database in order to share the digital signature of terrorist and violent extremist content that appears online, perhaps in an emerging attack, as I previously mentioned, in order to make sure that our members have the ability to use that information to inform their trust and safety operations. Before this, I worked in the tech and gaming space doing investigations on trust and safety related issues, particularly counterterrorism. And before that, I worked at the FBI where I did counterterrorism investigations. I worked at the FBI previous to this, and I was at Roblox. Roblox is the other company I worked at. Yeah, so like that's a good thing. All of the platforms, they need their own version of digital protection. Um, so that's a common response I get when I tell people about my previous work history. So this all ties really well today into our topic of this panel, right? So today we're talking about digital exploitation of platforms by extremists. Um, and I want us to really think about what that means. Right now, I think we're all kind of aware that oftentimes our online life and our offline life, the line between those is often quite blurry. We use technologies of all sorts in order to mediate our communication and everything that we do in our daily lives. For example, right now, I am using a digital file sharing service in order to take notes on what I'm saying right now. So I'm constantly engaging with this technology and using it, as we all are. Um, and oftentimes in this research space, people ask questions about, how do terrorists use the internet? And, it can vary, but oftentimes the answer is they're using it just in the same way that we do. It's just the difference of who they are, what they believe. Oftentimes what they engage in is something that's very different than what the platforms had initially intended their platforms to be used for. Uh, which is why it's very important that we have some sort of digital safety infrastructure. And, oftentimes the response, I would say somewhat reasonable, can be, okay, well, these platforms need to take that content off. And I think we all can agree with that sentiment, right? But the who, what, when, where, and why of terrorism is what makes it so complicated and what makes it so important that we have discussions like the one they're about to have today, because the definitions for terrorism are often, skewed across different, jurisdictions and governments. There's not a clear consensus that is really built. So it's important to have these professionals. So that kind of brings me to talking a little bit about our panelists today. So we have several online safety specialists here to help define what they do in this space. Many of them work on policy issues. They work on digital investigations. Some of them engage with law enforcement. Some of them are law enforcement or former, and some of them are academic researchers. So I'm really excited to have a good conversation with all of them, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment. But the way this is going to work is I'm going to go ahead, give them each a moment to introduce themselves. I'll read off their bio. I'll give them the time to say their statements, and then we will do a brief Q&A with some questions that I pre-prepared ahead of time. And then in the last third of our presentation, we'll go ahead and open the floor up to the audience to have a brief Q&A from folks. So without further ado, I will kind of move straight on into our introductory portion. So the first person I'm going to introduce here is Brian Hughes. Brian Hughes is the co-founder and executive director for the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL, here at American University. He's also a research assistant professor in the American University School of Public Affairs. Brian, I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk with you today. I know that we've talked before online, but I would love to have you just kind of talk about your, what you do in this space. It is.
Sure. Thanks, Skip. And thanks for being here, everyone. Thanks for giving me the chance to speak with you all today. I'll tell you a little bit about PERIL and a little bit about the work that we do there. PERIL is an applied research lab out of the School of Public Affairs. What we mean by an applied research lab is that we're not just trying to study the problem, we're not just trying to understand the problem, we're also trying to, insofar as we can, fix the problem, or at least improve the conditions that give rise to that problem. And PERIL's approach has been to try to attack that problem as far upstream as possible. So we try to do what's called primary prevention. Sometimes people even call it primordial prevention, although I don't like that term. It sounds too archaeological. But what that means is that we want to reduce the overall conditions in our communities that make it possible for hate, for extremism, conspiracy theory culture to grow in the first place. And these are really conditions that metastasize long before people begin misbehaving online. Before the online harms arrive, what we have are communities that lack resilience, communities that lack tolerance, inclusivity, and so on. So, what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand how our communities develop in those pathological ways, and then we're trying to figure out ways to improve that, to make them more inclusive, to make them more resilient, and more open to a sense that everyone has a say in the future of their lives. We take a few different approaches to that. Some of those have to do with developing capacity for dialogue, capacity for people within the communities to understand one another. There are a lot of harms that happen exclusively online, but as Skip mentioned, there's no distinction, really no sharp distinction to be drawn between online and off. And so, very frequently, the harms are leaking back into the offline world too. So we want people to be able to have dialogue. We want there to be a robust network of support, mutual understanding, support for victim survivors and for targeted communities, so that when those online harms do move into the real world, either in some action that takes place offline or just in the day-to-day life of the people who are affected by these harms, right? They're moving around offline. How can we see to it that the communities support them in the way that they need? The other track that we try to address, we try to look at the ways that we can inoculate people against online harms. So we do an awful lot of work understanding how propaganda and persuasion work, and how we can prepare people to recognize and resist manipulative media when they encounter it. How can we address the gratifications that people receive by engaging with harmful content online? We've done an awful lot of work in what's sometimes called pre-bunking or attitudinal inoculation, and we've had some really fantastic results in terms of being able to increase people's ability to recognize and resist harmful content when they encounter it online. As we get into Q&A, I'm sure I'll be going into more detail, but that's probably good for now.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So the next person I want to introduce is Briana Kablack. Briana is a policy manager in dangerous organizations team at Meta. She's previously a Brumley Next Generation Graduate Fellow at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. And she's one of my closest POCs that I work with at GIFCT. So I'm very excited to have Briana here to chat a bit. Briana, could you maybe give us a little background on yourself and what you do at Meta as you see it relating to the subject?
Yeah. Thank you, Skip, and thank you, American, for having us here today. So, as Skip mentioned, I work on something that we call the Dangerous Organizations and Individuals team at Meta. I'll use the term DOI to cover that. It's quite a long acronym. What DOI means at Meta is a broad range of extremist and kind of violent extremist and terrorist ideologies. Chiefly, we cover criminal organizations, terrorist organizations, and hate organizations. That policy also covers kind of a smaller subset of different types of violent ideologies. You might ask, what is Meta doing with a team that's working in this space? We're doing quite a lot, actually. Just as Skip mentioned, there's a lot of offline harm that also kind of manifests online. And Meta has been one of the kind of industry leaders in this space to really organize around how can we proactively play a role in mitigating these threats. Um, my team kind of covers this threat area in three key ways. The first is probably the most obvious, through enforcement. So what that means is basically when someone is posting something that's potentially harmful on Facebook or Instagram, how can we, as quickly as possible, find it and remove it so that doesn't spread across our platforms? Um, We do this in a range of ways. Facebook is or Meta platforms, so Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp are massive, as you all know. So we have a lot of what we call scaled systems. These are more automated computer-run systems that are able to find and remove content. We also have a large kind of threat investigative team, similar to what Skip was doing at Roblox. These are subject matter experts that are able to really dive deep and understand threat trends and things that we might not be able to find at scale, and remove those threats before they manifest online. So enforcement is one pillar. We do a lot of prevention work as well, similar to what Brian was talking about. How can we, in a more upstream, proactive sense, mitigate harms before they actually manifest online? So this is a lot of partnerships with NGOs. It's a lot of user-focused education and messaging to make sure that they understand the threats that might be coming at them on platform. And it's a lot of working across the industry with government, with research, with civil society to make sure that we're doing everything we can to best posture our platforms. So you have enforcement, you have prevention, and then one of the more kind of interesting aspects of what we do is engage externally. So Meta has a large team that's focused on this. However, we know that we don't know everything. So how can we learn from external experts? How can we engage with the government? How can we speak with researchers to better understand what's happening, ingest those insights, and tweak our policies, our enforcement approach internally? And then how can we bring that narrative back out and actually help to further the conversation through events like this? Um, so Meta has a very large team that's focused on this across a number of different areas. I cover the kind of strategic policy side of what we're doing. Um, I will say kind of briefly, because I think it's important, the way that this threat has evolved over the past 10 years or so. When you think back to kind of the beginning of the DOI team, basically at Meta, and the beginning of a lot of these sort of trust and safety focused teams at tech, I draw it back to kind of 2014, 2015, where you have the height of ISIS, Al Qaeda use of kind of social media to spread their message. This is very classic terrorism, designated terrorist organizations, branded propaganda, heading videos, that type of thing. While it was very new at the time, it was a relatively more simple threat to address. You could find a logo, you could remove it, and the problem not solved, but relatively handled. Over the past 10 years, we've seen the threat grow exponentially. You have the Buffalo shooting in New York. We have the live stream shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand. You have the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. Just really a proliferation of the types of actors that are involved, the way that they're using social media, and the way that they're kind of spreading their message. It's no longer just terrorism. It's a number of different hate ideologies. They're becoming more mainstream. The whole kind of landscape is becoming more murky. So that brings us to kind of where we are today. Meta has a range of different policies. It's not just terrorism. There's ideologies, there's hate organizations, there's criminal organizations. Um, you also have a proliferation of platforms. It's not just kind of the big, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft anymore. You have unnamed and kind of uncountable amount of platforms being involved, a proliferation of actors, and a proliferation of the way that they're using the platforms. So this, I think, is in a big way why GIFCT has been really important. You need kind of a convening body to help to set some norms and to help kind of collaborate. Um, I think ultimately some kind of key takeaways that I understand, and Skip said this earlier, is that the way that violent extremist actors are using social media is actually quite rational. They're using it in the same way that we would, to communicate with friends, to share information, to send money, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's kind of a key for how we might be able to counter these threats. And I think the other main takeaway is that stakeholder collaboration is necessary. You can't solve this problem alone. If Meta was perfect, it actually wouldn't fix the problem. They would move to Discord or other platforms and continue their harm. So you really need to work together across government, civil society, industry. And I think that that's a really important kind of point to make, and hopefully something we can talk about more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bria. I really appreciate it. That was a really good, overview of everything that you go through there. A lot of really good points that I hope we touch on a little bit more going forward. So our next speaker that we want to bring up is Christina Lopez. Christina is a senior analyst at Graphica. She provides intelligence and trust and safety research and on issues related to AI, media manipulation, propaganda, information operations, and social media platforms. I'm really excited to hear a lot more from you because you're covering a lot of like AI related stuff, which is so emerging for all of us. So I'm excited to hear a little bit more about your work.
Thank you so much for the invitation to this panel. It's going to be really hard to follow these speakers, but I'm just going to share a little bit about what we do at Graphica and how that applies to me and to this panel. Graphica is a social media intelligence firm, and really our bread and butter is to map communities and content all over the internet. And what that allows us to do is to learn how communities interact, how do they use these technologies and platforms, for what purposes, and this allows us to gain a little bit of insight, not only to make these platforms safer, but to learn from the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that these communities deploy in order to achieve their purposes. Their purposes really, and I think it's important that we hone in on this, are not very different than what anyone else would do on the internet. Extremist communities online are there to connect with one another, and they do that by creating content. And this content allows them to signal to each other that they belong, to signal to others that they're different from others, to connect with maybe like minded people who would like to join them. All of this we call often radicalization, but really is creating content. When it comes to AI, there is a lot out there that we don't know because of how fast this technology is evolving. But there is one thing that we do know, and extremism, it's not new. And throughout a lot of waves of change and technological evolution, extremism has adapted to what those waves are and sought out how best to use them to achieve its purposes. The fact that AI is here and it is new doesn't change that. And the way that extremist communities are adapting to AI is that it is acting as an accelerating factor. It's an accelerant that allows them to do the same things they were already doing, which is online, that is, which is reach each other, communicate to one another that they are similar, perhaps recruit like minded people, except this allows them to do that at scale. It just cuts costs into what it would have been doing the same thing before. And this is what we're seeing by and large, how communities are adapting to this technology. They are, again, using it to spread their message and to find like minded people, albeit in a faster and maybe a little higher quality way. But the same things that applied before apply still now. People are seeking community. Extremists are not no different in that way. And they are seeking to signal to each other that they think similarly. That's what allows them to maybe recruit new people and get their message out. I would love to talk to you about more specific applications and different ways that we are seeing extremists harness the power of AI. But the spoiler is that not very differently than what we are seeing all over the internet, that different communities are using AI in very similar ways, except their purposes are a lot more hateful.
Excellent. I'm over here now. Uh, I'm also not hovering over you anymore. But thank you so much. I really appreciated that overview. I mean, you do really interesting work, and again, like I'm excited to see more of it. I know like a lot of the work from Graphica has been reflected on GNet, which is GIFCT's academic research arm, which I recommend everyone take a look at. And if you're interested, maybe even come to write for. Um, but we do have one more speaker that I want to introduce here, someone I'm quite familiar with. His name is Tom Sobocinski. I know him as Sobo. He is a partner at the strategic advisor. Sorry, he's a partner and a strategic advisor um, at the risk analysis firm TDI. He's previously served for 25 years at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had his roles there as the special agent in charge of Baltimore Field Office. Pretty big deal. A deputy assistant director of the International Operations Division and the section chief and a section chief within the Counterterrorism Division. I've worked with Sobo in the past. I know he knows a lot about these kinds of subjects. So I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about your whole background and how you connect to the topic here.
Great. I'm really glad to be here to talk about this. Yeah, there's a bunch of titles that none of you have any idea what that really means. So, what I've essentially worked counterterrorism for almost 23 years, starting on September 12th, where I was at the Pentagon for a month digging through the rubble, and then the next 20 some odd years globally working counterterrorism issues. Lived overseas for about 5 years, North Africa, Middle East, and Europe, working the things that we're going to talk about. And then two jobs that I think were really important to this conversation is that in 18 and 19, I was the executive and responsible for domestic terrorism for the FBI. And so for those of you in this room, realize that I retired, sir, for a year. So let's say in 2016, things started to really change in America. 2018, 2019, the FBI figured that out. Unfortunately, it was a little late. So all the attacks that we just talked about were attacks that Skip was a part of the team, that we ran those globally. And so what we figured out was that the international scope of how this worked before was definitely changing. And there were a couple key things that made this really difficult for the FBI and continues to make it difficult. The first thing is easy, which is what's the FBI do? And they do two things. They protect the American people and they uphold the Constitution. Both of those are the foundational guidelines for how the FBI works. Now, let's shift to domestic terrorism. That's a really hard topic to talk about in an organization like the FBI, because we are talking about political speech. We are talking about hate speech. Both of those are protected by the Constitution. And so how does an organization go about addressing those issues prior to going into a Pentagon or going to a Walmart or a Buffalo? And so the FBI really honed in on three things that we focused on this threat. And the first one is it a crime? Is there a federal crime? And so if it is, the FBI can already look at that. We prioritize those federal crimes by acts of violence. That's the second pillar that we looked at. But those two things right there, the FBI is a powerful organization, can disrupt a lot of bad actors by those issues. The third piece was the political speech or the political motivation. That unfortunately hindered the FBI's view on it. We started prioritizing that third pillar, which was actually the least important pillar for us. And so once we, negated that issue and focused on the crime and the violence, the FBI, I think in 18 and 19, we were talking about 40, 50 arrests a year, and we were going up to 250 to 300 a year. We really focused on just disrupting these individuals before they acted. Now, as an American citizen not working for the FBI, I don't want the FBI telling me and being the guiding force over how our society talks about these issues. It is a government organization, a powerful government organization, but it is a societal problem that we're trying to address here on this. And after the fact, or even as these cases are going forward, what we found is I talk about this where Skip knows every morning I would have to meet with the director and the deputy director, and we give briefings. So it was a cycle of how we would do this. And we had a list in the domestic terrorism section of about 75 cases that we would monitor every day. And of those 75 cases, I would wake up every morning thinking any one of those would be the shooter, the bomber, or the person that would do that. And so some of the cases that were just mentioned, none of those were on our radar. And I would say the majority of the major violent events in 18 and 19 were not on our radar. And I think that just lays the scope of how prevalent this is. We talked about accelerant, and I really want to talk about that more, is that when you look at and you do an autopsy on these people's lives, the social media aspect, the online digital aspect of what that is, you get to see what that looks like. And working international terrorism, you had Al Qaeda, you had ISIS, and they would recruit, and they'd had an online vetting process to do this. And then, they were larger organizations. But what we found with these threats is that you had individuals who really tailored in and focused on the particular thing they hated. And you would have individuals who, and I use these just generically, I hate Black people. Well, I hate Black people in Virginia. I hate Black people who drive Priuses, I hate left-handed Black people who drive Priuses in Virginia. And all of a sudden, if you were in physical world, you're never going to meet somebody that hates like that. But in the online space, you are going to find those people. and you're going to be able to connect with those people. And then you are going to be able to talk about the thing you hate. And we would see over and over again, whatever that thing that they hated was, that drove them to actually do the violence. And then the one piece that I can talk about now, once again, wow, it's very free being out of FBI for less than a year. Guns. I mean, guns in America are pretty prevalent. I talk with my partners in Australia. I was based in the UK for a few years. Uh, if there was a person that had a gun, they knew it, and everything was addressed to mitigate that threat. Here in the US, that's not an issue. I expect everybody to have a gun, and if not, they'll get a gun pretty quickly to do whatever they need. So I look forward to having the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. What a really incredible group of panelists we have here. I'm excited to, kind of take this forward. So, now we're going to enter the piece where I'm going to give some questions that I have, prepared, and we're going to dig into these issues a little bit more. So I want to go back to Brian. I know a lot of your research, in your work at PERIL, has a lot to do with just like the design of platforms, even a bit, or how the design influences the actor, right? So could you tell us a little bit about how you view design of platforms and how that can like influence your outcomes essentially?
Sure. I'm a media and communication scholar by training before joining the School of Public Affairs. And the work that I did studying how design, engineering, and even more fundamentally than that, the infrastructure of our entire network digital communication infrastructure, how that all affects this problem, very much informed the work that we came to do at Peril, in part because it became so obvious to me and to my colleagues in the lab that the design, the engineering, and actually the fundamental infrastructure really create the conditions that make these problems extremely difficult to tackle in the sort of digital in the digital sphere. There's a few examples I always like to throw out. Um, Network digital communication technology has zero marginal costs for reproducing content. This means that the process of stamping out, banning, blocking things like the Christchurch video, have to be made a priority. It has to be an extremely high um, uh, uh, allocation of resources given to it because it's such a fundamental, unchangeable condition of the infrastructure that the meta platforms sit on top of in the first place. But things can get even more fundamental than that. You know, we didn't have to have a commercial internet. That was a choice that was made in the 1990s. It's where we are. But we we can we can think bigger and we can imagine more. And the mere fact that something creates an incredible challenge of political economy to change doesn't mean it's intractable like some kind of law of physics. Uh, and I think that sometimes, especially as we're addressing new technology, stuff like AI, we're kind of hindered by a lack of imagination that has trouble seeing beyond the ideology of the commercial internet that gave us so many good things. I don't want to be, a Luddite here, but 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 we can expand our scope and sort of, I think, we gain the upper hand over the technology that we wield. Is something that we hear in policy spaces in the U.S. and the EU and pretty much everywhere, is that AI is moving too fast. It's impossible to regulate. Lawmakers, policymakers can't regulate it because it's developing too quickly. Well, AI it isn't a plant. It isn't a farm animal. It doesn't have its own, it doesn't have its own biological, developmental code. It's being developed through the conditions of political economy that we enable. And if it's moving too quickly for us to mitigate harm, that's something that we can address. Now, again, this is like steering. I mean, it's harder than steering an aircraft carrier. So this is all just to kind of get us to try to think more broadly. But this is why prevention is so important. Why trying to address the social and emotional conditions that make a person seek out extremist milieus, extremist scenes to meet and to satisfy these needs for compensatory control and to address grievances or a sense of isolation and dislocation. if we can address the sense of isolation and dislocation, if we can address the grievances, if we can do things at the community level to try to address things like the sense of threat that people from traditionally privileged groups are feeling nowadays, if we can do things to address that, then these extremely wicked infrastructural problems that I'm glad I don't have to deal with, Meta, are it, hopefully those become smaller problems for everyone.
That's a very good answer. I think it's interesting to really bring this up to this idea of like, we have these massive like technological infrastructures and then the problem of political economy, as you mentioned. As you were speaking, I thought of like a metaphor of it's as if these platforms are massive sales ships with thousands of sails, and we want to decide which way each sail needs to go, but just one turn can change something you didn't even think you were changing. So that's definitely why it's such a good precarious situation and something that we need to really tackle with vigor. Um, so I want to move over to Bree a bit and ask a question about trends that you're seeing with dangerous organizations. You see all sorts of developments all over the world. I mean, it's a very interesting position that you sit in. How do you see? I mean, I guess what are the current trends that you see? I suppose.
Yeah, I think given the range of sort of types of harms that I deal with, the trends can be very different in the criminal space versus the hate space versus terrorism. I think one of the overarching trends that I'm personally sort of obsessed with recently is the involvement and the targeting of young people. Um, Given that I think it's something like 95% of young people are on social media. Um, they are using these platforms. They are being targeted by violent extremists, and oftentimes they are actually becoming violent extremists themselves. And that worries me because obviously, if you're young, you haven't fully developed your understanding of yourself and your community. You don't necessarily have a fully developed social circle or support system. I think that the availability of weapons in this country specifically, that concerns me for what it might mean for kind of a violent outcome. We are seeing a rise in specifically online young people that are sort of being pulled into these organizations, whether it's through recruiting or kind of like targeted exploitation, basically, and manipulation. Young people are very vulnerable. They're on these platforms, so they're an easy target. I also find it concerning that young people are targeting other young people. This has probably happened throughout humanity in like a classic sort of high school bullying scenario, but now it's much easier to do in private spaces online. And I find that cycle to be particularly concerning. And I think that happens across the threat areas that we deal with and across geographies. So that's something that we have been focusing on a lot recently. I also think it's kind of an interesting area for opportunity. Um, One of our sort of sister policy teams is called the safety policy team. They focus most on sort of young people and women's protection and stuff like that. We've been learning a lot with how they have been able to proactively safeguard youth and trying to apply it to the specific problem area of DOI. We're having a lot of early success, but I think that that's kind of an interesting opportunity, especially from a design perspective, of how we can introduce friction and better safeguard youth on platforms. And it's something that I've seen other companies dabbling in a little bit. So it's alarming, but also there's some space to grow there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot to really think about. I mean, especially what you're mentioning about young people targeting other young people. I know coming from the perspective of someone who's worked at a platform like you, that when you're thinking about safety, you're especially in the idea of like targeting children, you're often thinking about the stranger, right? Like, and that's one of the easier things to hone in on. Okay, this person is much older. They have no reason to know this young person. Okay, maybe that should be flagged. But when it comes to someone who's maybe your classmate, you do have a reason to know them. It wouldn't maybe ring as many alarm bells. You have to think of more sophisticated ways to monitor that harm. So definitely very concerning. Thank you. Uh, um, all right, so Christina, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about deep fakes and kind of AI augmented imagery. I think this is something that kind of goes in the direction of both the misinformation and the extremism, because you can use a deep fake to give some sort of extremist message. So how in your experience do you find it best to kind of counter this and also detect that something is an augmented image like a deep fake?
So detection is getting harder every day because the models are getting better every day. And that is, we have to be honest about that. There is still no technological forensic way to be able to immediately determine with a high degree of confidence whether something was created with AI. But I kind of want to flip the question a little bit, and just based on what we're seeing in the ways that these communities are using AI, it turns out that it doesn't matter too much whether it something was created with AI when the purposes of it are hateful propaganda. And it doesn't have to be very good is what I'm going for. Like, it doesn't have to fake anyone, or it doesn't have to mislead anyone, because the purposes really are for propaganda. And one example that I am going to use is, this is, I will also want to say, is pretty social media platform agnostic. Like, this can happen in any platform, and platforms in this case are just the distribution vectors. The AI harms here come often from open source models that can be manipulated by any community to fit their own uh, purposes. And so one of the things that we were seeing, we were looking at a community of anti-immigration extremists. And during the riots in the UK that emerged from a stabbing incident for which the immigrant community was pretty much scapegoated, we started seeing a lot of AI created images featuring a white lion fighting monkeys with the Union Jack behind. And it was obviously AI created. It wasn't trying to fool anyone into, assuming that this had been a real picture, but it was incredibly effective in getting the message out that this community was going to protect the sovereignty of the UK from immigrants. And what they were using for organizing these riots wasn't very sophisticated, and it wasn't necessarily powered by a large language model like AI. They were using copy paste text, like the classic, email chains that people used to get in the 90s. They were using the basic technologies of direct messaging to gather in front of immigrant resource centers and terrorize immigrants. And what we're seeing is that AI acts as a component of that, an accelerant that allows them to create this propaganda. Another way that we're seeing um, synthetic image and audio being used, again, for the purposes of hateful speech, is for the creation of fake attacks, like uh, the bombing of a mosque that hasn't occurred, and it gets put out not in with the intent of misleading yet. It gets put out with the intent of both terrorizing the communities that attend that mosque, and for the purposes of signaling to like-minded individuals, dream what could happen. So again, this is a propaganda, an accelerationist factor in propaganda production, but so it doesn't have to fool anyone yet to be effective. So some of the ways that we go about this, and it's a little bit depressing to like acknowledge, is you still need so much human work to be able to analyze this sort of content outputs. Sometimes all you have is you have to go frame by frame and do a lot of very boring human analysis of whether you can detect things that are unnatural and that can indicate that uncanny valley that, the lights could have not functioned in that way, or there's no way you could have portrayed shadows in that way, or like the blinking is not synced to how humans usually blink, or there's no blinking at all. So it's little like tells right now that allow you to, again, you can only assess with some degrees of confidence, but never fully assess unless it's really bad that something was not AI generated. I also think this won't be as important because even the very low quality ones already have the intended effect of exacerbating like hatred. And in the case of the UK anti-immigrant riots, it did the intended purpose of exacerbating anti-immigrant sentiment. So it doesn't even have to be that good.
Yeah. That's definitely very interesting to think about, even especially the point that you made about kind of fictionalized shootings on things like, that have not occurred. It kind of reminds me of like, God, like reading the transcripts of interviews and stuff like that. The kind of like testimonies of mass shooters who maybe stopped before they could have continued because they were more horrified by what they had done because it was different than the video that they had seen. And I think AI definitely has like a point in that where it's like, oh, this is what it could look like, but then it doesn't, you know. Um, that's definitely something that's very interesting. One thing I kind of want to touch on that you had just mentioned was the idea that like one of the main innovations of using AI in this harmful way is more I think of scale, because a lot of what you're discussing, I mean, what you described with the anti-immigrant imagery sounds a lot like old timey propaganda that was done with ink and paper. Going straight back to you. Uh, um, so how do you feel, like what are like the best strategies that you think there are for tackling that like scaled piece of it beyond just the investigation? And if that's maybe outside of your realm, but I'm interested to hear what you think.
I think because it's a network problem, the solution is a networked solution. So everyone has a role to play. And I think that the researchers that specialize in communities that understand what lexicon they're using and what memes are being used to convey, old-timey hateful meanings, those still matter so that the trust and safety work that platforms do is never over. And one of the good news is like it is effective. But what we know from communities is that they don't once form, they don't just disappear or disintegrate. They adapt to the design and they adapt to the different platform policies put in place to kind of make it difficult for them or add friction to their activities online. So they do adapt and move to places that are less hostile for their purposes. So I think the approach is still like everyone has a role to play and providing intel and valuable signals to trust and safety teams all over platforms that they can incorporate to their work to make detection often automatic or to indicate what could be some indicators like behavior indicators that this is a vulnerable online user that could fall prey to community radicalization. I think all those components matter. Of course, legislation is important, but sometimes you can't just legislate your way out of a problem that has so many factors. We're talking right now of an online problem that has a lot of offline factors, like Brian pointed out. And so I don't know that there is just one approach. I do believe that the important work of humans here and subject expertise in terms of radicalization, extremism, and the symbols that they use will still matter for a long time because it's what will allow us to power our automatic solutions into being better at keeping these tools safe.
As a subject matter expert, I agree. So thank you very much. No, the network approach is very important, and especially when you're getting to the point where now you're looking at actors making content, basically, or networks of actors. So Tom, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of your work with the Bureau. So right now, as I've kind of mentioned, the divide between the real world and the digital world are very porous, and some would argue it doesn't really exist because it's all the real world. That is very interesting with the FBI's mission, right? Because you're supposed to protect, the American people from these terrorist attacks that are going to happen. But so much of what happens occurs in a kind of a closed off space of these digital platforms. What really is the best way for the FBI to engage with platforms in such a way that they're able to share threat information that they're aware of, but they're also protecting, civil rights, so to speak.
Yeah, you really gave me an easy one.
Sorry.
Yeah, that this space is incredibly complicated, and defining what we agree on between the commercial and the government side of this is, I think, the key component of this. And so right now, I think we're failing in that. I mean, we can't even articulate what violence is or what potential violence or threat is in our communications with the commercial space. And so I think for us, it is on both sides, really sitting down and prioritizing it. Yeah, I am so pessimistic when it comes to this.
Oh, sorry. Bad question.
but this is, this is a commercial enterprise. It's a societal enterprise that's driven by other things other than a shared belief in stopping violence. That's just the reality of what it is. And even though there are certain companies that may be motivated to work with the FBI, we talk about Discord, 4chan, 8chan, any of the other ones, the blending and the movement of these threat actors in this environment is so fast and it is so porous that I don't necessarily know, other than harnessing AI, ML technology as it develops, using it for good as well as the nefarious purposes.
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting point. I know, like when I was working at the FBI, I often think like I wish I could tell the platform this, or like in a way that was not inappropriate, right? Um, but I think that's definitely like one of those like inherent kind of conflicts because you also don't want to be again acting inappropriate. Um, so Bree, I want to go to you and I want to ask you a question a little bit about like the challenges that you see from your perspective in this space. What really basically I don't want to say standing in your way, but are the kind of like obstacles for you to like work through in order to make the platform as safe as possible?
Um, I laugh because I feel like every day my job is to like arrive and try to like work through challenges. I think there are probably the things that I think stop the kind of like systematic efforts of what Meta is trying to do, and what a lot of industry and a lot of GIFCT team members are like. I think these challenges are sort of true across the board. One that I didn't know going into tech, I kind of sort of come from a research background. I had a lot of like very optimistic, aggressive thoughts going into tech about how things could be solved. Something that I didn't realize that I think should be talked more about is the inherent technological trade-off between quantity versus quality, basically. At the scale that we operate at, you either have to review as much as you can with slightly less precision, or you have to be more precise, and then you must review less. It takes longer to be more precise. Um, Excitingly, AI might and already is kind of helping this problem a little bit. It's accelerating the more kind of basic decisions that we don't necessarily need humans. If you see an ISIS flag, we know that that's violating, so take that down. You don't really need a human to make that decision if your AI is strong enough. Um, but still, you have this trade-off between quality and quantity. And I think that this is a really interesting, it's not a policy, I mean, it is a policy discussion, but it's like it's a technical, it's a number that you land on. And I think that if there was a more open discussion about that trade-off among government stakeholders, researchers that know the space very well, and tech companies who are ultimately making a decision, there would be a little bit more consensus around where we land on that issue. And I think right now companies make that decision very much internally. Um, there's obviously a lot of criticism that comes with a decision like that. But if that trade-off was more openly discussed, I think we could probably get past some of the day-to-day criticisms that come up every time there's a conflict, and we could get to really the meat of the problem, which is, more about speech or where to draw the line of a mainstream ideology. So I think that the technological trade-off is one main challenge. Um, Public criticism is another. I think that the criticism is so needed and so important for what's happening given we have a commercial internet. Um, but philosophically, how should a journalist pitch a story about tech that's not overly sensationalized, that's more accurate, but that people will read? They also are kind of like towing a line there. And I think oftentimes it ends in sort of these sensationalist news pieces that sometimes detract from what the real story is or where we could actually be making progress. And I can say internally, it really detracts resources from what we're able to do that's actually working and being productive. Um, I also think regulation is the piecemeal regulatory sort of landscape that we're facing right now is another place that just pulls priorities from where good work could be done. I think regulation is important. I think there's definitely a place for a more kind of a holistic approach to how to regulate tech. But right now, we face just a lot of these one-off inquiries that spin up really big work streams, and they do just kind of pull resources. So I think those are a lot of the kind of common challenges that tech is facing, beyond just Meta.
No, I think you're definitely right, and I can really relate to that. I mean, it reminds me of, when we at Roblox were working on some like regulatory workflows for certain regulations that were coming through, realizing there was another regulation that was coming through in a couple years, and I was like, oh, that's going to have to be a new workflow. And it'd be nice if there's one big workflow. But that's just how my brain works. So it's one of those things that you gotta, be holistic of in your thinking of when you're working on these things. Like, okay, how can I make this work for two different workflows? That sort of thing. So it's its own, bag of worms, its own can of worms that you open up when you have these kinds of conversations. And Bree, you really set up my next question, which is to Brian. So at GIFCT, we like to, have a multi-stakeholder approach. We have our working groups, which include, government, they include companies, and they also include academic researchers who are working on these issues. So like as Bree said, oftentimes, because of, wanting to make sure that the companies make a decision that works for it. These decisions are often made, internally. What do you see as the job or role of an organization like PERIL, right? When we're talking about, these multi-stakeholder things where we have governments, we have companies making important decisions.
Well, I think that the role of an organization like Peril is to be able to, in some ways, mediate between the most grassroots forms of communities and then those larger and more powerful stakeholders. We're the people who are talking to the mosques and the synagogues and the churches and the PTAs and the middle schools and you name it. That sort of the micro and meso level of community that occurs primarily offline, but by necessity has to engage with the online space too. And I think being able to really understand the needs of those communities and understand the problems that they face is what we can bring to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate that, and I agree with that. As someone who has to kind of deal with that side of things myself. Um, Now I want to bring it back for my last question to Tom a bit. So I know the last one I gave you was a doozy of a question. So I want to have a more uplifting question. Oh, this is great. So as I've mentioned, the threat landscape of technology and social media and different digital platforms has changed so much over the past couple decades. And you've been there for a lot of it, right? Like you said, from September 12th and on and on. What do you feel like, as the threat landscape has changed, what would you see as like your biggest, or maybe the FBI's biggest, like win in kind of getting in front of the threat and countering it essentially?
Yeah, that's not as easy as you think. Well, you called me old, and then now the so I think the win is that the FBI has turned into a more resilient organization, a more open organization to discuss the threat. We used to be early on in the international terrorism space, it was very restricted. It was only amongst the U.S. intelligence community, our global partners, and then we realized that the space of violence and hate, it was big enough to share with partners outside of us, so that we weren't going to solve that issue. And so I think our ability to get out and discuss it and articulate what that threat really looks like, and essentially share the risk and ownership of the threat, as opposed to setting itself up to respond to the actual events.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Sorry for calling you old. So your experience.
Yes.
Um, Well, that kind of is the end of my questions. Now I want to take a few minutes to open up the floor to the audience. If they have any questions that they want to ask of our panelists or of me, I'm happy to do that. Yes. This awesome online. Oh yes. And if you're online in Zoom world, could you please put some of your questions in the chat and we will address them here. Oh, hey, we have a question over there. Would you like to? We got a microphone coming to you.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Awesome. Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm a last semester master's in data science student here at AU. First of all, thank you for being here and talking about these really important things. I'm glad they're finally getting some airtime. One of the questions I have is for partly Christina and partly Brianna. One of the biggest concerns this year in terms of AI and online content moderation has been non consensual sexual content generated by generative AI, or for the layman, deepfake pornography. Obviously, there's a huge problem with, mainstream services are hosting those sites, hosting, their code sharing and payment processors and all that stuff. What has been the biggest challenge from both an outside perspective of the kinds of people who engage in that, and also from a platform perspective, how you deal with that kind of content, even though it's not really that well legally defined?
Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to give it a shot. So I really appreciate that you called it non-consensual intimate imagery, like NCAI. I feel like there's a problem with deepfake porn in that it takes the focus away from the actual harms of this output, which is a aspect of nobody that appears there consented to have their imagery shown or their likeness shown in that violatory way. One of the main challenges that we're finding is that there is still, from what I have seen in the communities that we have monitored that engage in these kinds of practices, a little bit of a disconnect between the consequence of producing this output. In a lot of minds, the fact that it's synthetic, the fact that it's not real, does means that there's no real harm to the actual person that is portrayed. There's also this absolute disconnect when it comes to portraying celebrities in this way, because there is this still cultural gap between acknowledging that the non-consensual aspect is the problem. There's this idea of that fame entails being portrayed in any way that people want to consume, and this is one of the ways. So one of the main aspects that is a challenge in this space is that you can have a lot of really good trust and safety teams that they are working around the clock to make the commercial tools that can be jailbroken to produce these outputs safer every day. But there's a lot of open source models out there that can be tweaked outside of in places that don't have legislation or are not interested in legislating in this, and then exported to be the supply, because there is demand for this kind of product, for the consumption of this product. And so there are a lot of spaces where it doesn't matter where you try to curb a little bit the challenge, you have emerging threats. Just to end up, we monitored one community that continues to be behind the creation of NCII that targets celebrities and like female politicians. And one of the things that was mind blowing to me was that after looking at their tactics, techniques, and procedures, we realized that the main incentive for them to be in this line of work wasn't even the outputs themselves. That was just a byproduct. The main motive that kept this community engaged and participating in producing these outputs was that they had created a daily challenge. It was a game, a daily challenge to jailbreak the most mainstream AI generative tools out there, the ones that are explicitly programmed to ban the production of these outputs. There's, a dime a dozen services that you can pay to make this very easy, but these people see themselves as masters of their craft, and so they're trying to go to the most difficult tools that explicitly ban the usage of real people, that explicitly like ban against using someone's likeness. And so the purpose was really to show, again, to signal to your community, this is what is at the bottom always, that you were so good, like that you were so skilled at prompt engineering that you were able to confuse the models enough to produce outputs that the models are not built in to create. So outside of like the legal complications, outside of like the cultural gap that there is between people like acknowledging that this creates real harms, there's also the fact that for a lot of communities, this is still a challenge, a game, and that is something that trust and safety teams like have to overcome every single day. And I don't envy that position, honestly.
Can I just add one point, which is I completely agree. I think that the sort of the adversarial aspect that we're dealing with here cannot be overstated. The sort of novel threats that we track on a day-to-day basis that our scaled systems aren't yet able to track are very challenging. They're really good at using and abusing the technologies. Um, a sort of formative text for me, not to date myself, is the 9/11 Commission report. And one of the key findings there was a failure of imagination. And I think I try to apply that, and I think my team does every time that we're sort of red teaming a new technology or thinking about the potential abuses. You have to get really insanely creative on how they could work around existing guardrails. And so I think, yeah, it's really trying to stay ahead of the adversarial aspects that's a challenge. Um, Again, I think there's a lot of space also for industry collaboration here. So once there's a potential solution, share that information so that we can tackle it more rapidly.
Wonderful question. Thank you so much. And honestly, like, sure, by all means.
Yeah, we've been fielding calls from schools all year about this, and what I'm hearing from my colleagues on both sides here is that the supply side of these tools is extremely difficult to reckon with, which means that we absolutely have to be dealing with the demand side, and that can only be dealt with through education about things like. I was so glad you said it, consent, but also consequences. Some of these the cases that we're hearing are minors who are producing this. They're not only producing tremendous harmful outcome for their peers, they're producing tremendous harmful outcomes for themselves. Educating them, their schools, and their parents is absolutely essential.
Thank you for that answer. Do we have
We have a question online, very related to the discussion. So if you find something to add, please do so. The question is, do you think there is a disconnect between non-consensual deepfakes and the normalization of sexually explicit media that is an everyday part of young people's lives?
I do. So I want to make sure that we're not stepping on anyone else's panels coming up, right? Okay, okay. Sounds good. Would anyone like to kind of jump on this?
I'll take a stab and I'll say that I think a lot of what we're seeing online mirrors what's happening offline. Not to be overly broad. This also isn't, just to be very clear, this isn't my area of expertise. It's actually a different policy team that handles this. But for the most part, I think the normalization of what's happening in our society now, it happens with hateful ideologies. I think it's happening with the sort of sexualization of minors and of women and minorities. I think you just see that mirrored online. So in short, I would say yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and I definitely agree. Oh, perfect. We have a question here.
Yeah. Well, I'm concerned. Um, if you look globally from a social media perspective, you have wars in multiple places, so there is forced migration because of that. If you look just last year, we had earthquakes in Morocco, floods in Libya, earthquakes in Turkey. That created 780,000 people migrating. So there are issues that deal with climate change, issues dealing with war. Uh, and yet we talk about the FBI. The FBI has no jurisdiction outside. So we're talking on one hand about globalization and all these issues that are actually happening everywhere. And we don't see a global on how to deal with and I understand there's going to be a lot of superposition with things that come later in the other panels. But how do you realize then this is not a U.S. centric issue; it's a global centric issue, and therefore different citizens have different needs, and yet uh, we need to have a more solidarity type of action between FBI, CIA, you name it, Interpol, whatever, so that you have a real meat behind the speech.
Absolutely. I can kind of take this one, and then if anyone else wants to add to it. So there are a few things to kind of go off of there. One, I mean, you're absolutely correct that we need to have a very global response to these issues that we're talking about. And I would say, I mean, I think we all work in some way in a different aspect of the threat area. I will take ownership. We have FBI representation here because that's my background. Mea culpa. I'll be honest. But as GIFCT, we do work a lot with the United Nations. We were actually just at the UN General Assembly last month in order to kind of talk to several different continents of representation of people who are very interested in this different subject. We as GIFCT are also very and always interested in having new members that are global, and we're always hosting workshops around the world in order to talk to different jurisdictions on the best ways for them to interact with tech companies. Because from our perspective, uh, a lot of the tech companies that do have a lot of reach and pull around the world, yeah, they are based in the United States, but that doesn't mean that those other jurisdictions don't have a need to be connected to them. So it's important. One thing that we're interested in is making sure that they know how to talk to them. So that is definitely something that, at least from the GICT perspective, we're very cognizant of. And then there's another element of your question here about kind of like climate change and global war. I mean, those are very of grave concern to us. But I do think it is kind of to Bree's point about like precision and scale. We are a very small organization ourselves. We have to kind of figure out what we as a small organization can reasonably handle. I will tell you that talking to different government officials and the UN, there's constant conversation that I'm having with people who are like, oh, we need to do a gift CT for X, Y, and Z other issue. So I do think the appetite is there for something like that. I just think it would just require probably a new mandate, to be honest. But thank you for the question. Does anyone else want to
Yeah.
have on that?
I think that's a fair question. I mean, I'm not going to solve climate change or war up here today. But the reality is, I spent, you know, years of my life living there in other countries and meeting with these partners. But I use one key example. I mean, look at Germany. It's illegal to have a Nazi flag. It is illegal to have Mein Kampf. Who's the number one exporter of National Socialist flags and Mein Kampf? It's the U.S. And so those are legal definitions that prohibit us and don't allow us to stop the inflow of a legal product into a country that really cares about this. And that's the complexity of this. That's just one example. Child exploitation is the other. We talked about artificial imagery we didn't mention children in particular, but it exists. Um, you know, th- about a quarter of the world hasn't even criminalized actual child exploitation. So, I mean, it's all of those differences make the enforcement of this and the resolution of this really complicated.
Yes, hello. I'm sorry. By the way, this is a shameless plug for the evolutionary psychology talk that I will give today, which is only 15 minutes long. So, the question here is how to go on the offensive, and a suggestion which we need to discuss, and I'm very available to think what insights we gain from evolutionary psychology variables, such as using disgust, for example, lowering somebody's status, not just sitting, as you all so well do, diligently try to take stuff down. How does the community go on the offensive in using these? And there's much to discuss. It's been completely missing from the space. There's only like two or three institutions or, academic teams that deal with these. One of them, the University of Aarhus, for example. But we can get a lot of traction by doing this. Thank you. Sorry.
Very good question. So, I mean, I feel like there's a couple people on the panel who could speak to this. Does anyone want to go?
Well, I think that gosh, I think that there's sort of there's there's a broader topic that I can speak to. I can't really speak to the question of evolutionary psychology. Although I will say that I think that I think that there is a reluctance to aggressively pursue tactics like invoking disgust and lowering status among practitioners who work in things like education and clergy and so forth. For reasons that you can probably deduce. But the broader topic, I think, is this question of how to go on the offensive. Um, uh, you know, I think that I I think the word imagination has gotten brought up a few times, and I think that being able to think beyond our assumptions and understand that the conditions that we find ourselves in today weren't handed down to us from on high. They're not set in stone, and we can change them. I think that there's actually a very valuable model to be looked to in history with the women's temperance movement. People think of the women's temperance movement and they think of prohibition and they think of the utter disaster that prohibition was, and they're right. But that wasn't the majority of temperance. That was only the sort of final overreach that ended things. Leading up to that, there were tremendous social improvements made as a result of that movement. Things that had to do with improving the conditions of women in the home, denormalizing spousal abuse, denormalizing alcohol addiction, addressing the treatment of alcoholism. Maybe it's time to have a digital temperance movement. I'm not saying let's shut it down. That's the prohibition that would be a disaster. But we are allowed to spend less time online. We are allowed to build more offline alternatives for our children and our communities. Those are choices that are available to us, but we have to actually take that step. That's something that actually requires some agency and some initiative and some stick-to-itiveness, but we can do it. It is possible. And so, if I could urge everyone to take one thing out of, whatever I've had to say here today, it's that we can imagine a world where we continue to enjoy the benefits of digital while not being wholly subordinate to it.
I'm not so sure. Just very good. It's a very good answer. Does anyone else want to go? Or we want to move on to our next question.
I should begin by saying that Andre whispered in my ear that mine should be the last question before the break. The program. Still have 20 minutes.
Okay. Oh, so keep them coming.
More an observation than a question. One of the technical problems that we're dealing with clearly here is how do you handle massive real-time data flows? And this is a problem that the military and the intelligence community are dealing with all the time. And I certainly hope that there's good communication there, because presumably the people who have to worry about how do you react to what drones see should be willing to share it at least with the FBI if they're not already doing that.
Between the FBI and the military? Or yes, absolutely. We post 9/11 have been very close with them.
So that's the perfect question for you. No, do we have any other questions that we want to kind of address? Oh, hey, how you doing, Bill? Oh, never mind. You first, and then you.
Hi. Sorry. Hi. Really great panel. Thank you. I think you all represent kind of industry, academia, civil society excellently, and you've covered kind of harm reduction and prevention. But going back to your point about fundamentals, I think it'd be really interesting to understand from all your perspectives what fundamentally needs to change so that your organizations can fare better, especially because this is such a interdisciplinary topic. We covered kind of sexual-based violence. The following IEEE workshop is going to talk about that. We've got a founder of a organization that is looking to do that. And so it'd be interesting to hear from you guys what needs to change to make your lives easier. But actually, when we talk about extremism, it's not just kind of an issue of national security, an issue of and the things you've touched upon. It's really about fundamentally who we are as humans, how we treat each other. And so it'd be great to understand that a little bit from your perspectives.
All right, thank you so much. I think we can all answer that one. First of all, I want to say, as an extremism researcher, more research. It's what we need. But no, did you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's for everybody in this room to do it better, to be honest with you. I mean, the FBI is a triage organization. We're not prepared to stop law enforcement in general, partners as well. They're not prepared to stop this. And so I think for everybody to recognize this isn't an academic or commercial issue. I've spent 25 years, first responders all over the world have done this, picking up bodies, dealing with parents, dealing with family members who've lost loved ones. And Skip talked about it earlier about there's been individuals who have stopped mid-mass shooting because they didn't realize there was going to be so much blood. And that's not a one-off. We've seen that on several instances. And so I think that while we talk about the normalization of sexual imagery, we talk about the normalization of violence, it looks very different in the real world. And so I think that there needs to be bluntly a more mature approach to what's going on with this. We do not show images of mass violence in a realistic way from a media perspective. I think from the U.S.'s perspective, if they see what this looks like, as opposed to a number, as opposed to happen in that neighborhood in my community, we may have a different view on this.
I have two. I think the first is collaboration. Instead of competing with one another for resources and space, I think working together and sharing information is fundamental. And second, I think is sort of to Brian's point about um, rethinking how we all use social media and understanding that feeling empowered, that we are all part of a solution here. Whether that's flagging content online or like having an in-person conversation with your neighbor about something. I think it's Meta can't solve it alone. The FBI can't solve it alone. It really is like a societal uh, moment.
This is a pretty boring answer, but from a primary prevention point of view, funding. The funding that's available for primary prevention is just infinitesimal. You look at I can't draw the number off the top of my head what the DHS annual budget is. The amount that's devoted to prevention in the CP3 office is like a rounding error. You blink and you miss it. And that's it as far as federal funding goes for real primary stuff. The Biden administration, to its credit, has put out calls to incorporate funding for this kind of work through Health and Human Services and the Department of Ed and so on. And we need more of that. It's just as simple as that. You need money to do the work.
I think I'm going to echo a little bit of that. I think that one of the main challenges when it comes to hidden extremism is that online we're seeing like the tip of the iceberg of a lot of offline factors. And you can't always solve the offline factors through online algorithmic changes or more online research. The second part of that, and this is again, like this is in general, we need more data access. To be able to learn about these communities, you need so much data. And the fact of the matter is that we are dealing with an industry that is full of trade-offs, that is truly has to trade off between protecting civil rights and privacy and making access available for anyone who might want it, and to have to justify like why do you want access to data. So there is a lot of philosophical questions in terms of how do you get that access, who gets that access, who is obligated to provide it. But that is still one of the main challenges when it comes to trying to understand what is going on online in general.
And then I kind of want to throw something in there myself. I made a silly joke earlier about more research. But I think in reality, what I think would just be a holistic improvement, especially, I'm sure me and Bree can, talk about that as a bed, like the pervasive view by some companies that, trust and safety is like a cost center, right? I think that's something that needs to change, because ultimately, it is, you're saving yourself, but you're saving yourself future heartache by investing in trust and safety and having that funding. But you don't know what you don't know. So if you stop something from happening, then maybe there's no number that tells you how much money you saved or whatever, right? But it's definitely, it's obviously fundamental, because like I said, it mediates so much of our everyday lives. It's basically another piece of society, so it needs to be protected.
Can I just say one thing on that? Yeah, I want to echo that. They have been incredibly effective. I'm talking about the negative connotations and connections that we've had, but the relationships with Meta and others have been incredibly productive. And I will say they have stopped violence. And there are defined ways, and I think that As the years go by, more and more of that will come out and be more open. But they absolutely are doing an effective job on that.
But that's honestly, that's so true because like you look at some of the press releases that came out when we were going, we were in the bureau, and I was like, it says it right there, like that they blagged us. That's definitely true. So you had a question. I'm sorry. We keep.
No, you're so you're so good. Slightly comedic comment to start this off. I've never been in a room where people have mentioned 9/11 so many times before. Being from New York, it's like you don't talk about 9, like you just don't mention it. But my actual question is, uh, where is there's kind of a trade-off between transparency and explainability versus like the need for security, and kind of where do you look for finding that balance, especially when considering that kind of like the main hallmarkers of and data protection is coming from these kind of like paramilitary organizations across the globe, and what are their roles in kind of like promoting digital or like preventing and promoting digital imperialism?
You want to take a stab at that? So, um, I mean, I guess I can answer in a more general way. Um, so I think there is like in all sorts of things in this like safety space, like the delicate balance between like security and privacy. This idea that I don't think it necessarily has to be a trade-off, but often it definitely is viewed in that way. So as far as transparency is concerned, I can only speak for my organization. We do strive to be as transparent as we possibly can. But I'm sure people in the tech world will tell you that there hasn't been a time that they've been transparent that hasn't been kind of like thrown back in their face in some way. So I do think that kind of dynamic can kind of put a damper on efforts to be transparent. But obviously, I do think it's kind of like a fundamental core thing that we need to be taking account of on the piece of just like who holds the information, who's giving us information. I think I mean, we're in a somewhat like almost like a limited type space because the and GIFCT for sure, and I'm assuming many tech companies are not out running human operations in the field where we're going out and like having sources in different countries. So we are having to rely on the sourcing that we do have. I do think that kind of gets to the previous question about like being global and trying to make sure that you're not privileging only one perspective and you are kind of reading news sources outside of your normal realm of what is considered to be kind of acceptable in like the Western space, which is something that I try to do as a practice so that I know that I'm not just kind of, forwarding the FBI's line on certain things because that's not where I work anymore. So that's kind of my perspective. I don't know if that kind of speaks to y'all's experience, but that's what I have.
Yeah, I think I want to caveat my answer with it won't be satisfying. Like I would have to be like in this essay I will. But if I can try to take a stab at it, I would also say that one concern when it comes to when you're dealing with safety and security issues is sometimes a level of transparency that is counterproductive because you are basically informing other potential bad actors, giving them a recipe on how to circumvent and on where, certain tools are vulnerable. And so when it comes to transparency for the sake of accountability, there's also a consideration of how you could be empowering those who could potentially use that information for, targeting vulnerabilities in different other tools. There's plenty of examples of ways in which communities, learn and adapt from, algorithmic tweaks that have in which case you do have to consider like who is going to use this transparency and what they're going to use it for. That's always one of the things that people are weighing when they are making these kinds of decisions.
I will also just add, there is an enormous amount of transparency already out there that I think the public just doesn't necessarily know about. Meta has extensively reported on enforcement takedowns, law enforcement requests. Um, you can look it up. It's called our Community Standards Enforcement Report. We report quarterly. A massive amount of data is in there. GIFCT as one of their membership requirements. A member company has to regularly produce a transparency report. I believe that you compile that somewhere online.
Yeah, it's in our publications section. I was going to go back to mention that we do have our transparency report. I do think you're bringing up a good point that oftentimes the transparency reports are they're very unsexy, so to speak. And it just it can be kind of dry, which I think also gets back to one of your previous points about, how this information is shared like in a media format. Because oftentimes the transparency is not, it's not a headline grabber. Um, it is like, as Christina kind of mentioned, like this isn't going to be like the most satisfying answer in the universe. So I apologize for that, but I hope that we were able to kind of fill in the gaps a bit.
Hey, hi, yeah. So you've talked about how this is an adversarial problem, but we can't tell the American people how to talk to each other. So is it just a core problem to figure out if some speech comes from an adversary versus comes from some person who sprung it out of their own head? How do would those be treated differently if that could be determined?
So I guess I'm kind of trying to make sure I understand the question appropriately. So are you saying is the mission more about like deciding who is a part of like a terrorist organization versus who is doing the behavior?
Where does the speech come from? Yeah, I guess who's doing the behavior? Yeah, online.
Yeah, I think for the FBI, it doesn't matter. The hate speech is the hate speech, or the violent acceleration speech. I will say there are nation state actors, and the FBI and the director have talked about this quite a bit, that are very much involved in the domestic space to manipulate and accelerate various ideologies right now. And that is an absolute problem because it is very cheap for a nation state actor to get involved and to interject themselves into this type of stuff, and they're very good at it.
I can also kind of speak on that a bit. So I think this kind of gets back to some of the earlier conversations we were having at the beginning of the panel about how the threat landscape has evolved over time. Kind of, I think Bree was mentioning this, like, when we were talking more about these organized groups, like someone like ISIS that's operating and like has, basically is behaving like someone who's holding territory, has official branding and official media. Still have that. But that's by and large not like the biggest nexus that people are looking at these days. It was maybe a little bit easier to say, okay, this is speech coming from an adversary, it's branded content. But I think it's kind of to the point of people getting around the different policies once they figure out that, okay, if this gets branded with the ISIS logo, they're going to know I'm the adversary, they're going to take it down. From where was sitting at the FBI doing like this domestic terrorism type work, the FBI doesn't have like a designations list for domestic organizations. That would be very bad, as we've seen in the past. So that's why you get into this thing of you have to come at it from a more behavioral perspective. At GIFCT, we do have something of like a two-pronged approach, right? We have our UN designations as one criteria for being involved in our hash sharing database. So really, I mean, that's a bunch of individuals, but it boils down to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. From there, if you're not ISIS or Al-Qaeda, we have our behavioral criterias, which include, doing some sort of having some sort of like hate-based ideology, advocating for violence, etc. So I think you can have both, but obviously I think that kind of like group affiliated piece is always going to be easier to scale, right? So it's that trade-off again.
Okay.
Does it?
Can I take the last question?
Absolutely.
Okay. I want to just pull us away from the US in one perspective, and also bring it a little bit towards civil society as well. So the first thing, a comment was made before. In fact, a couple of you have made comments that are very much from a US perspective. Other countries do have domestic terrorist lists and do ban them, and it works perfectly well. The US has a different approach, and that's fine. But there are other approaches that do work. There's also laws in other countries that do mediate what individuals can say in conversations that are in public or in a setting where the public can overhear, even if they're private in quotes conversations. And that comes back to protecting human dignity, and does mean we have things like in Australia, where I'm from, Hezbollah is a prescribed organization.
prescribed organization. So their flag, which was recently flown in some protests, police are investigating the individuals that were flying those flags um, because they have broken counterterrorism laws. On the other hand, as a response to this, there's now a whole lot of people running around with plain yellow flags with no logos on them. And this does not break any laws, even though it's very clear what they try to say, because the rule is very specific. So I just wanted to highlight that point, but then ask the role of civil society. Because again, in the US, I think civil society has a very strong role and is fairly well funded from private donors. Government money, yes, is always an issue, but there is a lot of philanthropy to help civil society address things. Again, in some other countries, there's a view that government should be dealing with these problems, and there's not very much support for civil society, and certainly not for expert civil society as opposed to community groups, the impacted community of XYZ sort of extremism versus think tanks and others that work in space. If I can ask the panel firstly, what your views are in terms of the balance between different types of actors, thinking globally, particularly. And also, this is an IEEE conference. The IEEE is an organization with, I think it was 475,000 people last I checked the stats. So almost half a million people, all of whom are experts in one form or other of engineering or technology. We have members around the world. We have local groups around the world. What can we do as people that are experts in the technology, that have that international base, that have large outreach through universities, tech companies, society as a whole? What's your message for us to take away? And other than running another conference, what can we do?
One thing I want to kind of point out before we kind of like pass it off to the rest of the panel, I do want to kind of really talk about your point about like the different domestic terrorism lists or just terrorism lists that exist in other countries. I don't want to think that I don't take this very seriously, because I do. It's actually kind of interesting, kind of to Tom's prior point about when we're working with a government like Germany, where it is illegal to fly the Nazi flag, for example. Because the United States is often seen as like the big exporter of like these sorts of flags. And when you work at a private company, oftentimes you want to have, when I'm working at, like, let's say when I was working at Roblox, when we're coming up with a policy for what should be counted as like counterterrorism or violent extremism, the answer is never going to be accepted as Skip says it is, so therefore it is. We want to be able to point at some either method of saying like, okay, it meets this criteria that already existed, or pointing at these kinds of laws that exist in places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and United Kingdom, which have a lot more muscle in actually prescribing some groups that would never be prescribed in the United States, based off of my experience, unless something changes. So want to definitely flag those as being very important, as saying like, this is a big government says this is not good. This is something we can actually kind of point to and point at. Does anyone else have something they want to add? I saw Bruce kind of rearing up.
I guess more so to your question on civil society and partnerships. I think at the beginning I highlighted the three sort of key areas of work that Meta has focused on: DOI, enforcement, prevention, and external engagement. Civil society plays a key role in each of those. On the enforcement side, we regularly meet with expert civil society groups to sort of sense check where we are on certain, removal calibrations. We engage with civil society when we're developing a new policy to get feedback and to get their perspective on that policy. On the prevention side, civil society is sort of a very much a key stakeholder in bridging the gap between our platforms and the users that we're dealing with. So if someone actually needs on the ground support, we use civil society and our partner organizations to provide that, I think, as a much probably more legitimate arbiter of truth than Meta might be. And on the external side, of course, I regularly am engaging with civil society. Remind me of the second part of your question.
Well, the second part was about IEEE as an organization of professionals in the technology space. what can or should we be doing to assist the companies, the governments, the civil society groups from our position of expertise?
So I would. This is maybe not the most novel answer, but like continue to engage. GIFCT has working groups that engage civil society. That's a really great avenue to get connected with tech companies who are dealing with these issues. Fund research, write research. That stuff very much is used by the industry, and it doesn't exist unless the experts on the ground are doing it. And it is, we ingest it. I read papers. I look at what people are saying. I um, appreciate the work that civil society does. It's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to call that out with GiveCT and our different working groups. We have, like I said, our hash sharing database. We have our incident response framework. We have folks from civil society in there, making helping us make some of the key decisions. And we would really never like do something completely out of left field without any kind of civil society input. I think that it would be seen as illegitimate because we've made it such a fundamental piece of the way that we conduct business. And we absolutely encourage anyone in this room who wants to be part of this, please come and reach out to me. I'd love to, have conversations with you about it. And in addition to that, I think another area where specifically you, from this engineering perspective, I think there's definitely a big appetite lately for like the open sourcing of different pieces of code that are very helpful. I know that Meta has been doing a lot with their Hasher, Matcher, Actioner, making that available for many of our member companies in order to help them get onboarded to our services. But there's still so much work to do in that space because safety, it should be something that we can all agree on. So working together on projects like that, I know that's something that I'm interested in.